searching for answers, and we're glad you're searching right along with us. Second letter of the Apostle Paul to a young colleague named Timothy, who is just cutting his pastoral teeth, so to speak, over at a problematic church in Ephesus. Paul, his mentor, is nowhere near him. He's across the ocean over in Rome, as we understand. But nonetheless, we have been working together through this text, asking ourselves what we would say if we were writing this letter to this young colleague, and inviting you to help us think about it along the way. So while you get your Bible, we'll introduce ourselves, and we'll get started. Dr. Katie Coe, professor at La Sierra, in the area of the history of Christian thought, together with Pastor Ji-Young Lee, who is completing her doctoral dissertation in the School of Education at La Sierra University. Dr. Leo Rancelin, New Testament scholar at Loma Linda University, and I say this with great sympathy, Dean of the School of Religion at that august institution. Big salutes. We're happy for you and for them that they have you as their leader. My name is John Jones, La Sierra University, and we are winding up in this session the last chapter of the second letter to Timothy. So while you find 2 Timothy in your New Testament, we will wade into it. We invite you to read along with us in whatever language, whatever version works for you. It may be a little different from the one we're reading from or the one that you see on the screen, but you will understand that, and we will enjoy sharing the quest as we seek to discern what the text meant when it was first written, what it means in our lives today. Pastor Lee.
Yes.
We're down halfway through this last chapter, chapter 4, and we're down to the personal greetings and things, and yet there are some things for us to notice as we go. So if you would like to start us off with verse 9 in chapter 4, just take us right down through to the end, if you would.
Sure.
And then we'll see what we make of it.
Okay.
You're reading from
NRSV.
the New Revised Standard.
Yes.
Okay.
So starting with verse 9, do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful in my ministry. I have sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and, above all, the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will pay him back for his deeds. You also must beware of him, for he strongly opposed our message. At my first offense, no one came to my support, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained in Corinth. Trophimus I left ill in Miletus. Do your best to come before winter. Eubulus sends greetings to you, as do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers and sisters. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
A lot of names.
Yes, yes.
But we read between the lines a little bit, don't we? Anything in particular you want to pick up on here?
Well, just like the genealogy sections in the Bible, when I was younger, I either tried to memorize these names or try to get through them somehow with some entertaining thoughts. But as I've tried to be a little more of a scholar, I'm finding that each name is a life. And each name holds a story, a very long and special and unique story. And I mean, this is obviously, we're assuming that this is real. These people are real, people that Paul and Timothy knew together. But as the Bible usually is, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some symbolic meanings behind them too. And between the two of them, Paul and Timothy, just the mention of someone's name had to have brought up memories and special meanings and inside jokes maybe even. And why these people? I mean, I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know until we get to heaven and ask Paul. But why these people and not others is one question in my head. And I believe we mentioned this several months ago too, but verse 14, Alexander, the coppersmith, did me great harm. The Lord will pay him back for his deeds. That came at me very unexpectedly the first time I read it, because here's Paul wrapping up his ministry, wrapping up 2 Timothy, or what we call 2 Timothy, and he slips that in there. The Lord will pay him back for his deeds. Beware of him. And then he goes through, and then another unexpected input was the end of verse 17. After he mentions how the Lord stood by him and gave him strength, he, to me, suddenly says, "So I was rescued from the lion's mouth." That was interesting too. So I'm still thinking about that. What does that "so" mean?
Yeah, a lot of stories here.
Yes, yes.
We wish we knew. Well, it is certainly a picture of a movement that is in motion, right?
Yes.
Leo?
Yes.
So-and-so is here, so-and-so's there. I left so-and-so, but so-and-so's coming, and by the way, I'm sending so-and-so to you.
Right.
It's a busy operation
That's
in a way,
right.
isn't it?
Exactly. But even now here until the end, Paul is lifting himself as a model to Timothy. And the motif that gets picked up here yet again is the motif of apostasy that runs through this these 4 chapters. Remember, Paul said earlier that all who are in Asia turned away from me, and he lists 2 people there, the jealous and Hermogenes. And now here he speaks of Demas deserting him. When he had his first defense, everybody deserted him. And so in chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So reminding anew, Timothy, boy, discharging the apostolic ministry is a real challenge. You may, at the end, stand all alone like I am here after my first defense. But take courage that the Lord stood by me and gave me strength as I sat in a Roman prison all by myself. And so he's underscoring again to Timothy, look at me as a model of faithfulness, of suffering in hope, even now to the very end. I see that reflected here in at the close. And of course, again, don't forget earlier, in Antioch and Iconium and Lystra, all that I went through there. And if you go back and read Acts 13 and 14, it was a challenging period of Paul's apostolic ministry. So I'm just so struck through this letter how that motif of Paul's, and he lists them, persecutions, sufferings, and conduct, and way of life, and carrying out the ministry.
I think this fits in well with what we were discussing in our last episode, which is this idea of the hardships that you're going to face in ministerial life. And one of the key hardships that he's highlighting here is betrayal, lack of relationship. And that fits in with this idea, too, that he was speaking about just a little earlier in this chapter about the righteousness of God. God is righteous, and he wants relationship with us. He establishes relationship with us through grace. And we accept that grace, and we enter into it. And then once we're in that relationship with him, one of the best ways to foster and further our spiritual life and our relationship with God is in our relationships with others on this earth. And so here Paul is saying, I've run the race, I've done well, but I've had hardships. And for someone who values relationship with God and with others, one of his greatest hardships is going to be being turned on by those that he's trusted and cared for the most.
Yep.
And so I see this all fitting in this summary of the Christian life of, we start relationship with God, we start relationship with others. Others are going to fail us, but God is going to be with us. He's going to stay with us. So that really, I think, jumps out to me in this because he really seems heartbroken for their loss of faith, and also heartbroken that they've betrayed him.
Yeah.
That the word that I have here is that they've deserted me.
Yeah.
That's not an easy, in some ways that's the most painful part of it all, isn't it? That's bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why 4:17 is so powerful to me. In the midst of all of that, he can say, yet the Lord stood by me and gave me strength.
Yeah. We have greetings when Paul writes a letter to Rome. In that last chapter of his, in the letter to Rome, chapter 16, he's saying hello to everybody, kind of like he's doing here, greetings here and there.
Yes.
And he mentions greetings to Prisca or Priscilla
Right.
and Aquila. At that point, they're in Rome.
Yeah.
Now, we think Paul is in Rome, and he's sending greetings to Timothy, who is apparently in Ephesus. We're not sure of the whole story there.
Yeah.
These are Greco-Roman names,
Right.
and yet it appears that they are themselves ethnically Jewish. And it appears that at a point in time when there was enough dissension among Jewish groups in Rome that the emperor simply threw all Jews out of Rome and said, if you're Jewish, get out of here. It's a constant turmoil. And we read of the grounds for that, and it seems like it's a disorder that's being stirred up in some way connected with somebody by the name of Chrestus, C-H-R-E-S-T-U-S, but in Latin, E and I often are rather interchangeable. In fact, even in Greek they are. So we wonder if this is not a person, but arguments over Christ, Christus, that may have been causing a good deal of dissent among Jews with one another, different groups in Rome, to the extent that all Jews were simply thrown out, finally, which would explain why Prisca and Aquila are over here in Ephesus. This is a bit of a surmise, but not much. The evidence seems to point to coincide with what we know of this little episode.
It's
What do you make of verse 14? Alexander the coppersmith.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
There were economics involved. People were not buying the copper or bronze images that they were making, perhaps.
Could be the reason why Paul's in a Roman prison.
Could be, that's right, absolutely. It could be an
Did he create
economic.
harm?
Yes,
Could be
indeed.
the,
Well, he was
watch
driven,
out for him.
He was driven out of Ephesus for that reason for a while.
Exactly, out of
Yeah.
Ephesus for similar reasons. So here's this story, and Paul cannot resist a little zinger in there. But let's be careful.
Yeah.
Let's be careful. When you read this in the original Greek, it is not an imprecation. He does not say, may the Lord pay him back for his deeds, which would be a very common expression. We read expressions like that in Greek Koine, common Greek literature of the day among Gentiles. May God strike him dead for whatever. You read that in many letters. Paul's not doing that. In fact, it's almost dismissive. It's like saying, don't be resentful toward Alexander. Don't feel like you need to get even with him or stir up anything against him. God will take care of him. It's almost dismissive, isn't it? That's God's business. It's not our business. We don't need to exert ourselves in this. Isn't that interesting? So it's a statement, it's an affirmative statement. It's not
A curse.
it's not a curse. That's
Right,
right. It's not
right.
wishing. It's not optative mode. It's not wishing that God would do something. Yeah, that strikes me. I think we need to pay attention to that.
I'm grateful you pointed that out, Dr. Jones, because in that light,
Yeah.
in that context of not cursing
Yeah.
Alexander, this whole, the last pericope, verse 9 through the end, 22, is seeming much more like a picture of community to me now. People you need to kind of beware of.
Yeah, look out.
Because
Just steer clear.
he's harmful. And then friends who, Prisca and Aquila, as you pointed out in Romans 16, they risk their necks for Paul, is what he says in Romans. So it's because it was interesting to me as to why, when he's finishing this letter, of course he's telling Timothy to come soon, so we know they'll be talking more. But at least in this letter, why talk about these people when he could be getting more intimate with Timothy, was my first question. But then after listening to what you're saying, I'm thinking Christianity is all about community.
Yeah.
And not just personal meditation, although that is a part of it, or just a friendship between two people, but it's a community including people who harm us, including people who desert us. And maybe if what Paul has been saying all throughout is true, then don't be surprised if Alexander is in heaven too, because he's a brother, and that's hard to accept sometimes.
But Paul is still carrying out his ministry here in the end.
Still a minister. Yep.
Yes.
And, you know, as you
Yep.
mentioned Aquila and Prisca, we might want to say something about John Mark, perhaps, in 4:11, right? This may well be the John Mark that led to that falling out in Acts, the second missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas had issues with John Mark. Paul didn't want to take John Mark. He's kind of, because he had deserted them earlier. They had a falling out, and Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways. This could be a reference to that John Mark, where he gets
could.
rehabilitated
Yes.
and affirmed.
And he's useful to me now.
Exactly.
You know, and indeed that
reconciliation, perhaps.
might explain why Paul feels compelled to say that. He's a good help after all.
Right.
Right. It is amazing. The scholars who have tried to trace the expansion of Christianity in the first century after Christ, it is astonishing how rapidly it spread. Eastward, although the church pays modern church pays less attention to that, but that's an untold story too. But particularly westward, right across, Paul expresses his own desire to get to Spain. We don't know if that purpose was ever fulfilled or not. It may have been. But with or without Paul going to Spain, the church is expanding. Within Paul's own lifetime here, it's already into Europe, and it's across Asia Minor and Turkey and so forth, and it's moving down into Egypt and wherever. It's given the stringencies of the day, it's amazing, particularly since travel was not year-round. In fact, that's exactly why Paul says, do your best to come before winter, because once winter sets in, sea travel stops, and land travel almost does. That's just how it was.
And many of these cities are port cities.
They are. And so, yeah, right.
Which is a great place to set up a church, because there are lots of ideas being traded in port cities as well as goods. And you can get out of them if you get in a little bit of trouble quite quickly on a ship, but not always, as you're saying. Once winter sets in, it becomes more difficult to travel both by sea as well as by land, because once it starts raining and the roads are muddy, you can't get a cart through. It's much more difficult to get a horse through that situation as well. They get stuck. But you do kind of see the way that Christianity is expanding, and there's a lot of focus on these port cities as it does.
For good reason.
Absolutely.
What else before we take a backward look across these two letters, or are we ready to do that now? First and Second Timothy, we're not sure of the sequence, but it's likely that they were written in the sequence in which they appear in our Bibles. What do we generalize? What do we see as we look back over these two correspondences between this aging and veteran apostle and this young acolyte of Paul's. What do we see? What meanings do these letters bear for us today in our own lives?
So as the church began to grow and expand, as you said, there was the need for some degree of organization. We needed elders and deacons assigned. The church had to wrestle with its message and begin to articulate what the Orthodox faith looked like. And you get a hint from both epistles that there were some false teachers present at the church at Ephesus that caused Paul some profound concern and that Timothy needed to address. And so, and the challenge that brings to having a church where growth can take place.
How the church looks in terms, to its non-Christian neighbors. What will the neighbors think?
Right.
There's a sense of public respectability, decency. Christians should be pillars of society, so to
Right.
speak. Yeah.
The household of God. The other motif that I think it's important to underscore here is this concern for the well-being of church members. We saw the concern with widows, right, in the previous epistle, that we need to truly take care of those in need that are present within the church.
I think there's a certain amount of empathy that's extended by Paul here as well as admonitions. People work is difficult, and living in a Christian community and being the leader of that community is a hard job. It's a work that comes with disappointments and with trials and with difficult responsibilities, like having to go to people and say, you're not saying or doing right according to this message that we're supposed to be living in. And so I think in many ways this is both a guide for church leadership, but also a reminder to be kind to those who are leading our communities, because it's not an easy work.
Exactly.
You know, lifestyle itself is an issue here, too. Paul, kind of a vagabond, always in motion, always moving from place to place. You know, when we go back to the Old Testament, we find these prophets, you know, who are always kind of out on the edges of civilization. They're out in the desert in some cases, living on locusts and honey or whatever they can find, and probably needing a good shave and a bath, you know, and whatever. But that idea in the Old Testament, that sense of radical sacrifice and dependent on God, you know, that was a powerful idea. Hebrews were originally sheep herders and nomadic people, and so that when they wanted to get next to God, they went back out into the desert again. Not in civilized Hellenistic Rome, that empire. Rather, if you were just one of those people, you could easily be misunderstood as a parasite on society, a kind of a nobody and dismissible person, you know, and the way to be respectable is to settle down in some place and have an insula, a house in a town, and take care of people who come to you with needs, and be respected, and by the way, raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and stuff like that, you know.
Right.
So the very lifestyle could be symbolic of a shift in values. The Hellenistic world was very different from the old Hebrew world out of which part of our Old Testament comes. That is a challenge in and of itself. Timothy is expected to stay put, although there's a possibility of his journeying to Rome at one point here. Yeah.
And yet, as you said, these texts are historically conditioned and
Yep.
context specific.
Yep.
this is how one should conduct oneself in the household of God, to live a life of peace, and quiet, and all godliness and dignity. And so the early church imbibed some of the sentiments and aspects of that culture that are reflected here. And I see that in particular with respect to the role of women in the life of the church. And 1 Timothy chapter 2, there's some problematic text there. And we saw that also in 2 Timothy. So I think when one interprets these two epistles, you need to take into consideration the stuff that's time-bound, part of that culture, and yet timeless. And that is such an important hermeneutical or interpretive move.
It really is, isn't it?
To properly interpret these epistles.
What was specific to that time and place, and what is of enduring value and
Exactly.
perspective. We're going to have to talk about that some more. Probably, maybe we'll pick up on this in our next conversation. We've got a few more things to observe here, but get back to us next time on this one, because this is going to be interesting, isn't it? What else hits us? Timothy, don't let anybody look down on you because you're young. Stay with it, Timothy. But don't be demanding of people's respect. Just simply deserve it, you know?
Rekindle the gift of God within you.
Yeah.
Understand your core
Exactly so.
identity
Yeah.
as a servant of
Yeah.
And going back to the first book, the first letter to
Yes.
Timothy, in chapter 4, he has this entire section, not just on how Timothy should relate to his church members, but how he should be conducting himself as well. So there's personal responsibility as well as an urging to help others take personal responsibility for their conduct.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, Timothy, the girls, treat them like your sisters, and their mothers treat them like your mother. You know, there's some conventional wisdom that comes through here.
Absolutely.
The people of that time and place were not completely devoid of ethical criteria and moral standards. They seldom lived up to their standards. They did not do very well in fulfilling them, did they? But they had their check marks. They had their boxes to check of how to behave and how not to behave. Indeed, archaeologists have discovered these tablets that apparently hung in people's homes to be sober-minded and a good example, and things not to be, lying and disobedient to parents and so forth. Isn't that interesting?
Very.
So here, Christianity finds itself in a very pagan world, which is an alien world, and yet there are standards, which if Christianity will but live up to them, will command the respect of the non-Christians as well. Yeah, and I suppose that when we're looking for lessons for our lives today, we maybe don't need to look any further than that, because there are a lot of people in this world who know better than they do and will respect it in followers of Christ. Now, we're going to have to pick up some of that and decode it and unpack it. Join us again next time for an interesting discussion, Searching for Answers.